Most of the major sports in the United States allow players to score multiple points on a single play. Baseball has the grand slam. Basketball has the foul shot, field goal, and three-pointer. Football alone has touchdowns, field goals, extra points, safeties, and two-point conversions. The only sport out of the big four that doesn't allow for it is hockey. Every goal is worth a single point, which raises the question, what if hockey had a two-point line? Let's start with what that would look like. Here's a normal hockey rink, and here's a rink with a two-point line added. I've made the decision to have it be a semicircle, roughly the width of the rink, centered a bit behind the goal crease. In this new league, a goal would be counted as a two-pointer if it was scored on a goalie from beyond the two-point line. I specify that the goal needs to be scored on a goalie because, in hockey, a team always has the option of swapping their goalie out for an extra skater. This usually happens when a team is down by one late into a game. It's the last desperate measure they can attempt to pull off a comeback. But it leaves them wide open to be scored on. It's the perfect trade-off of defense for offense, and I don't want to disrupt that by allowing empty net goals to count as two-pointers. I started by pulling the game data for the last 3 NHL seasons and determined how far each goal was scored from. If the goal was scored from more than 43.5 feet from the goal mouth on a goalie, it was rescored as a two-point goal. In this example, there were 3 goals scored from beyond the two-point line. However, only one of them counts as a two-point goal since the other 2 were scored on an empty net. While gathering this data, I needed to account for overtime games. There were quite a few games that originally went to overtime, but would have ended earlier if a two-point goal had been scored. Goals scored during overtimes that would not have happened were thrown out. So, as an example, in this game, the Tampa Bay Lightning beat the Seattle Kraken 4-3 in overtime. However, because all 3 of Seattle's goals were two-pointers, in our new league, the game never would have gone to overtime in the first place, and Seattle would have won 6-3 in regulation. This, as well as the other rescoring, led to some games that ended in ties. I didn't want to figure out how to simulate overtime for tied games, so in the case of a tie, I just gave both teams 1 point in the standings instead of the usual 2 for a win. Here we can see the distribution of every goal scored in the 23-24 season. Fewer than 10% of all goals scored were two-pointers. There's a good reason for this, which is that it's really hard to score from beyond the two-point line. There are usually around 5 skaters and a goalie in between you and the net, and even if you manage to score a goal on a shot from this distance, it has to be a clean shot into the net that doesn't deflect off of one of your teammates' sticks or bodies, since the goal goes to the last player who touched the puck. In our rescored seasons, a two-point goal was scored in about 1/3 of the games, but the result of a game, which team won or lost, only changed 13% of the time. If we filter out the ties, we get all of the games where the outcome was completely flipped by the two-point line. The original winner becomes the loser, and vice versa. We'll call these flipped outcome games. About 7% of the games in our rescored seasons were flipped outcome games, which seems like an acceptable and potentially even welcome rate of chaos for me. The team that scored the most two-pointers was, surprisingly, the 21-22 San Jose Sharks. That season, they missed the playoffs by 20 points, proving that the number of two-pointers a team scored is no indication of how good the team is. The Sharks managed to put up 28 two-pointers, good for 15% of their total goals. They had the most unique players score a two-pointer out of any team I looked at, though almost half of them were scored by just 2 defensemen, Brent Burns and Erik Karlsson. Both are among the best offensive defensemen in the league and rank 3rd and 5th in total two-pointers scored since 2021. Here we have the standings for the 23-24 season before and after implementing the two-point line. One of the most interesting stories for me in these newly rescored seasons was the Pittsburgh Penguins. They were a middling team at best that season, missing the playoffs by a few places. However, with the addition of the 2-point line, they jumped 7 spots in the overall standings, moving into 3rd place in the Metropolitan Division and easily making the playoffs. So why did they jump so much in the standings? Well, for starters, they scored the second most 2-pointers that season, led by defensemen Chris Letang and Erik Karlsson. Oh hey, he's on the Penguins now. Let's take a look at the Penguins' games where a 2-point goal affected the outcome. Every single one of them was originally a 1-goal loss, which the Penguins turned into a win or a tie. This points to one of the most interesting developments with the introduction of the 2-point line: chaos in the middle of the pack. The top 12 teams stayed the exact same in every season, all still making the playoffs. The bottom 12 remained almost the same as well, which makes sense. Good teams are still going to be good, and bad teams are still going to suck. It was the teams that were decent but not amazing who saw more significant shuffling around throughout the 2-point line season. These 8 teams were vying for the last 4 playoff spots, meaning that a single win in either direction could mean the difference between making and missing the playoffs. And a single 2-point goal would be enough to change the outcome of a close game. This increased level of chaos in close games means that there was more opportunity for teams to swing a close game in their favor. And if we look at the matchups between teams in the top, middle, and bottom of the standings, we can see that the addition of the 2-point line benefited middling teams the most. Despite there only being 8 teams in the middle, middling teams won more of the flipped outcome games, particularly against teams in the top 12. In my opinion, this level of chaos would lead to more interesting playoff races throughout the season. And what about the playoffs themselves? Interestingly, the 2-point line barely affected the outcome of the playoffs at all. In the regular season, we saw that the outcome of a game flipped 7% of the time. In the playoffs, that value dropped to 1.1%. Only 3 games out of the 265 total playoff games had their outcomes flipped, and none of them happened in Game 7, meaning that the results of the playoffs did not change in any of the 3 seasons that I looked at. A few series would have gone to extra games, but without a way to simulate those games, there's no way of knowing if that would have affected anything in the long run. We've looked at how the 2-point line would have affected the teams. Now let's take a look at the players. Here's a chart showing every player's goal totals, compared to the number of 2-pointers they scored. Out here we have Austin Matthews, far and away the most prolific goal scorer across these 3 seasons. Of his 169 goals, only 3 of them were scored from beyond the 2-point line, about 1.7% of his total goals. Leafs fans will be happy to know that exactly one of those 2-pointers came in the 23-24 season, meaning that he would have become the first player to crack 70 goals since 1992. Up here, we can see Roman Josi, the highest 2-point scorer in these seasons, with 26 2-pointers, good for 40% of his total goals. He's one of the best defensemen in the league, so his place here is not all that surprising. A more interesting notable player is Jacob Bernard Docker, a solid defensive prospect who's known more for his excellent skating and defensive IQ than his offense. Bernard Docker started his NHL career in the 21-22 season and is the only active player in the NHL who scored every goal in his career from beyond the 2-point line. Great job, Jacob. In this new league, offensive defensemen would rank as some of the most valuable players. They would be best positioned to score 2-pointers, as defensemen generally play higher in the zone out past the 2-point line. If we look at the relative increase in scoring after the introduction of the 2-point line, we see a very clear trend emerge. The players who saw the biggest increase in their scoring were all defensemen. It takes us 78 players before we see our first forward. And Connor McDavid, widely regarded as the best hockey player in the world, the top point scorer in 2 of those 3 seasons, is all the way down here, having only scored 1 of his 140 goals from beyond the 2-point line. Looking at the goalies, we see that save percentage would decrease overall in the new league. Save percentage measures saves divided by total shots, so a 910 save percentage means that a goalie saved 91% of the shots they faced. 903 is average. Anything below 890 is pretty bad. The addition of the 2-point line cratered the save percentages of some goalies like Alexander Georgiev. In the actual 23-24 season, he struggled near the beginning of the season, but managed to get things back on track as it went on, ending up close to league average. In the 2-point line season, he never managed to recover from his early season spiral, ending up with a barely playable 888 save percentage. In contrast, Connor Hellebuyck's 23-24 season looks even more remarkable. Hellebuyck faced the third most shots of any goalie in the league and only allowed 5 2-pointers on 1,798 shots, resulting in a 918 updated save percentage. Even in the actual non-2-point line season, that save percentage would be good enough for 5th place among all goalies. This is even more impressive when you consider that he played more than twice as many games as any of the goalies in 1st to 4th places. And finally, we have to talk about my favorite 2-point goal. For this one, we have to go to the second round of the 21-22 playoffs, better known as the Battle of Alberta. It was the first time the Edmonton Oilers and Calgary Flames had faced each other in the playoffs since 1991, but their rivalry burned just as strong as it had for the last 40 years. In Game 4, down 3-2, the Calgary Flames took a penalty. That's usually a bad thing, but after a careless turnover by the Oilers' young defenseman Evan Bouchard, Rasmus Andersson saw his opportunity and fired a shot down the ice, completely surprising goaltender Mike Smith and tying the game on a shorthanded goal. So why is this my favorite 2-pointer? It doesn't look particularly notable. It's pretty much right on the 2-point... Oh, he was shooting that way? Mike Smith allowed a shorthanded, game-tying goal in the playoffs against his team's fiercest rival from 139 feet away. No other 2-pointer cracked 100. So, we've talked about what the 2-point line would add to the game, but what would be the downside of introducing it? This is the story of a single game that radically altered the future of at least 5 different teams. Let's start small, with the 2 teams that actually played in the game. The Pittsburgh Penguins were one of the most consistently good teams in the NHL over the past 2 decades. Prior to 2023, they had made the playoffs for 17 years straight, riding high on the talents of Sidney Crosby, their captain and one of the best players to ever play the game. They struggled under the management of GM Ron Hextall, but a stellar year from a 36-year-old Crosby kept them in the playoff race for most of the season. The Chicago Blackhawks were, and still are, a terrible team, in just about every way you can imagine. We could talk in length about their racist name and logo. We could also talk about Chicago's cover-up of the sexual assault of players by a coach in 2010. But that's not what this video is about. For the purposes of this discussion, all you need to know is that in 2023, the Chicago Blackhawks were an awful team. Intentionally so. In the summer of 2022, they sold off basically every capable player on their roster, in the clearest example of tanking that the NHL had seen in a while. The reason for this? The top prospect in the 2023 draft, an 18-year-old kid by the name of Connor Bedard. Connor Bedard is an explosive offensive talent, the kind of player that a team can build a franchise around. In Chicago, we're looking to do exactly that. The draft works on a lottery system, with lower placement in the regular season standings meaning a higher probability that you'll get the first draft pick. To guarantee the best odds at drafting Bedard, Chicago was doing their best to worm their way into last place. Which brings us to this game. Pittsburgh versus Chicago, which took place on April 11th, 2023. It was the last week of the regular season, and with 2 games to go, the Penguins only needed to win this game to guarantee their spot in the playoffs. They were cutting it close, but they were playing Chicago, a team that was trying to lose as hard as a team can try to lose. Chicago, for their part, was exactly where they wanted to be, in dead last place, with an 18.5% chance at drafting Connor Bedard first overall. Both teams, or at least the fans and management of both teams, wanted the same outcome for the game, so it should have been nothing more than a formality. Despite this, the Blackhawks, a team whose entire roster combined was worse than Pittsburgh's fourth line, ended up beating the Penguins 5-2. This win took Chicago from 32nd to 30th place in the standings. Pittsburgh's GM, Ron Hextall, was fired shortly afterwards. The knock-on effects from this loss were massive, but we'll get to those. First, let's take a step back and introduce you to the rest of the players in this little farce. When the Pittsburgh Penguins lost their game against the Chicago Blackhawks, it moved the needle just enough for the Florida Panthers to steal Pittsburgh's playoff spot, sneaking into the playoffs by a single point. The only problem? The Florida Panthers were a mess. They spent the back half of the season floundering in the middle of the standings, despite a career-best year from their superstar agitator, Matthew Tkachuk. If you haven't met Matthew Tkachuk before, let me put him into perspective for you. In the 22-23 season, he was the 5th highest scoring player in the league, putting up 109 points. At the same time, he was the 4th most penalized player, putting up 123 penalty minutes, just behind his little brother, Brady. While Tkachuk was living up to the hype, the Panthers were hindered by injuries and the unreliable play of their $10.5 million starting goalie, Sergei Bobrovsky. Going into the playoffs, expectations for the Florida Panthers were low. The Toronto Maple Leafs have not made it to the Stanley Cup Final since 1967. In 2019, they lost to a Zamboni driver they employed. By 2023, it had been 19 years since they had made it past the first round of the playoffs. Oh, hey, look, it's the Panthers. All that being said, under the analytics-driven leadership of their GM, Kyle Dubas, the Leafs built an extremely solid regular season team, placing in the top 10 teams for 4 seasons straight. With almost 50% of their team's salary cap going to their top 4 forwards, the core 4, there were a lot of expectations riding on this team. This was going to be their year. The 22-23 Boston Bruins were the best regular season team in NHL history. That's not hyperbole. Let's go back and take a look at those standing charts again. Here's the Blackhawks at the bottom, the Penguins and Panthers in the mushy middle, and all the way up here we have Toronto and the Carolina Hurricanes in second place. Hang on, I thought we were talking about the Bruins. Oh, there they are. The distance between the 22-23 Bruins and the second place team was greater than the distance between 2nd and 17th. They reached an unprecedented 135 points and 65 wins, shattering a record that had stood for over 47 years. They were expected to blow through the first few rounds of the playoffs en route to a well-deserved Stanley Cup win. I can't talk about Boston without talking about their goalies. Jeremy Swayman and Linus Ullmark were one of the very few true goalie tandems in hockey, meaning that neither one of them was the starting goaltender for the team. They shared the duties relatively equally. Across the 3 seasons that they played together, Ullmark started 127 games and Swayman started 115, and both of them were excellent. In the Bruins' historic 22-23 season, they each started more than 35 games, with Ullmark posting a .938 save percentage and Swayman posting a .920. For reference, the league average save percentage that year was .903, putting both goalies more than 17 percentage points above the league average. Their combined average save percentage was better than all but 3 goalies in the league, and one of those goalies was Linus Ullmark. Ullmark won the Vezina Trophy as the league's best goalie and became only the 13th goalie to score a goal.
Ullmark is gonna try it, and he scores!
But that's not even the most important thing about Swayman and Ullmark. See, after a win, they have this tradition that, well, I'll let you see for yourself. Anyways, here come the dominoes. Since the Panthers snuck into the last playoff spot as the 17th seeded team, they were guaranteed to play the Boston Bruins in their first round. Things were going as expected, with Boston pulling ahead in the best-of-7 series to lead the Panthers 3-1. The Bruins opted not to continue with their goalie rotation, instead relying on Ullmark to start every game. The Panthers managed to take Game 5 to overtime, and with the series on the line, a tired Linus Ullmark came out of the net to play the puck. He turned it over to Carter Verhaeghe, who passed it to Tkachuk for the game-winning goal. Tkachuk put up 2 more goals in Game 6, leading the Panthers to a 7-5 victory that saw Ullmark's postseason save percentage drop to .896. It was the first time all year that any team had scored 6 goals on him. In the final game of the series, the Bruins decided to swap goalies, putting Jeremy Swayman in net instead of Ullmark. It wasn't enough. With less than a minute to go, the Panthers scored to tie the game at 3, and 8 minutes into overtime with 3 Bruins on him, Matthew Tkachuk managed to get out a pass to Sam Reinhart, who passed it to Carter Verhaeghe for the series-clinching goal. The hockey world was stunned. The best regular season team in history, a team that had seemed like a sure thing, was convincingly beaten by a team that barely made it into the playoffs and hadn't won a playoff series since 1996. The last team to set a record for number of wins in a season was the 2019 Tampa Bay Lightning, with 62. Like the 2023 Boston Bruins, the Lightning suffered a massive upset in the first round of the playoffs when they were swept by the Columbus Blue Jackets. The Blue Jackets goalie? Sergei Bobrovsky. In other stunning news, the Toronto Maple Leafs won their first playoff series in 21 years, defeating the Tampa Bay Lightning in 6 games. They went on to play the Florida Panthers in the next round, and Florida was once again an underdog. It was Toronto's series to lose. And lose they did, in a disappointing 5-game fashion. The core 4 failed to score in the first 3 games. The last time they had gone 3 games without scoring was, well, never. Hadn't happened before. As a result of losing the series, their GM, Kyle Dubas, was fired. Matthew Tkachuk had 5 assists in this series. No goals, but his reputation as a pest to play against inspired Panthers fans to resurrect a tradition from the last time they had won a playoff series, all the way back in 1996. Let the rats rain down. I can explain. Back on October 8th, 1995, the Panthers captain Scott Mellanby killed a rat in the locker room with his stick while getting ready for a game. He went on to score 2 goals that night, which the Panthers goalie John Van Beesbroek referred to as a rat trick. That was all it took. Fans began to throw plastic rats onto the ice after the Panthers scored a goal, and by the time they were heading into the 1996 Stanley Cup Finals, the rats numbered in the hundreds. The Panthers partnered with an exterminator company to have them clean up the rink after every goal. This tradition had largely been forgotten, but with the Panthers' return to playoff relevancy, the fans took it upon themselves to make 2023 the second year of the Rat. The Panthers went on to sweep the Carolina Hurricanes in the Eastern Conference Final. This series was mainly notable for its first game, a quadruple overtime game that ranks as the 6th longest in NHL history. Matthew Tkachuk scored the game-winning goal at 1:54 a.m. after almost 80 minutes of extra hockey. He went on to have 2 more game-winning goals and an assist on the 4th. Sergei Bobrovsky was playing some of the best hockey of his career, posting a .935 save percentage. All good stories must come to an end, and sadly the Florida Panthers story ended with them losing to the Vegas Golden Knights in the Stanley Cup Final. Sergei Bobrovsky turned into a pumpkin, putting up a miserable .828 save percentage. Matthew Tkachuk reminded us all of his reputation as a rat, racking up 50 penalty minutes in 4 games, before missing the final game of the series due to a broken sternum he suffered in Game 3. That's right, Game 3. Matthew Tkachuk played Game 4, took 14 minutes of penalties, and got a game misconduct with a broken sternum. Despite losing in the finals, the Florida Panthers made history. They had the most difficult path to the Stanley Cup Final of any team since the league started in 1917. No other team has faced harder opponents on the path to losing in the Stanley Cup Final. They defeated the best regular season team in history, as well as the 2nd and 4th place teams before losing to the 5th. The closest another team has come to that was the 03-04 Calgary Flames, who faced the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 7th teams. But the Flames came into the playoffs as the 12th place team. The Panthers were 17th. Now to tie up one more loose end. The NHL draft last summer, because they had moved from 32nd to 30th place, Chicago's odds at the first overall pick and Connor Bedard had dropped from 18.5% to 11.5%. Despite all that, when the lottery number came up, it was the 30th place team who got to pick first, meaning that Chicago still somehow managed to do what they'd set their sights on all season, drafting their future franchise player, Connor Bedard. So to recap, on April 11th, 2023, the worst team in the NHL beat the Pittsburgh Penguins, resulting in the Penguins missing the playoffs, getting their GM fired, the 17th-seeded Panthers sneaking into the playoffs, the best team in NHL history getting eliminated in the first round, the Toronto Maple Leafs getting washed after winning their first playoff series in 20 years, getting their GM fired, the Florida Panthers making the most improbable run to the Stanley Cup playoffs that we've ever seen, and Chicago drafting the best young player of the last 5 years. Oh, and at the end of all of this, Kyle Dubas, the former GM of the Maple Leafs, was hired as, you guessed it, the new GM of the Pittsburgh Penguins. So, why is this my case against the 2-point line? Would the Penguins have miraculously beaten the Blackhawks and reset the timeline to what we all expected? No, they would have been beaten worse, losing 7-2 instead of 5-2. But it wouldn't have mattered. In our 2-point line season, as a chaotic middling team, Florida would have missed the playoffs. The Penguins might have managed to sneak in depending on how many of their ties they won. The Blackhawks would have placed 31st instead of 30th and wouldn't have been selected to draft Connor Bedard. In other words, it would have been just another game. And that's not much of a story to tell.